Everyone, my name is Erin Fox. I will be moderating the back end of the event. Thank you all for joining us. Just to go ahead and give you a little bit more information about us before you get started. Laura, if you want to progress to the next slide. It's always tricky, that first one. Awesome. So thanks for joining us. This video is being recorded. You should have received a little kind of consent box. If you go ahead and click OK for that. We will be posting the recording to our YouTube page later this week. So if you search Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Center on YouTube, you'll find us as well as a lot of other videos if you're interested or if anyone misses any part of this event. If you have any questions throughout the event, please go ahead and submit those to the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that and we'll address all the questions at the end of the presentation. I will be putting a link to an event evaluation also in the chat box if you don't mind completing that. We appreciate all feedback that you have. A little bit more information about the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Center. We are a research center focused on memory and aging research here in Ann Arbor. We also offer a variety of different wellness programs and support groups for those living with or caring for someone with memory loss. Today we'll be focusing a little bit on those wellness programs that Laura moderates. So a little bit more about our speaker here. Laura Rice-Eschker leads the Wellness Initiative at our center, where she designs, implements, and evaluates well-being and mindfulness-based programming. She's a founding member of the Ann Arbor Center for Mindfulness and serves as CEO of the Presence Care Project, where she trains new facilitators in mindfulness-based dementia care. She is committed to co-creating and sharing contemplative programs assisting care partners, adults living with memory loss, and community members in their desire to live meaningful and connected lives. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Laura. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Erin, and good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend this time in your day here, this beautiful morning, and hello to all of you who may know me, and perhaps you've participated in a wellness program at the MADC, or maybe you've heard a presentation of mine before regarding caregiver well-being, these programs or mindfulness practice, or if attending this speaker series is something you regularly do. And if none of these, a particularly warm welcome to you and to any newcomers. We are glad you're here. So this is me, and I'm over here all by myself in this webinar format. So in preparing for today, and considering what's possible in the time that we have. And because this isn't a class or a program, it's very much unlike the virtual programs that I'm accustomed to facilitating. So as this is one-sided, I hope you'll join me. I hope from wherever you are that you'll participate and be as active as possible for yourself. So we'll be together in this alone zone, one-sided sharing, and I hope to enhance your engagement just a little bit more with a few polls and a couple of inquiries. And in addition, you'll see here the addition of caregiver wisdom and insights. And so our panel are the voices of caregivers who I'm privileged to work alongside and learn from, and hope that you will also be moved by what they have to say, since I am here really representing also this population as best I can, and their voices are so critical. So I'd like to also invite you to graft your own experiences into the listening and in the content that I'll be sharing, how you relate to it personally and what resonates as we dip our toes into the pools of caregiver well-being this morning. I have a rather ambitious agenda today. So first, if you wouldn't mind, please, just leaning in to take this one poll: who you are, why you are primarily here. This slick Zoom polling I find really helpful. And once you answer, perhaps considering too why you're really here, what really prompted you to show up for this in your life, in your full life, what this means. So this poll question is about the role you may have, or primarily in this space, though it's really not about the needs and the questions you may have, and also to consider how you might stay with this commitment to be here just for this little while. So thank you for doing this. So what can you expect this morning? So after a brief introduction, once again, beyond me into the programs of the Wellness Initiative, in a little bit here as we go through context, so we can pause to look at these results as well. Primarily family caregivers and care partners. Thank you, glad you're here. So we'll return again to the programming at the end of our time together. So I'll be doing a little bit of an overview and then we'll return to it after we have this discussion. What feels most compelling though and helpful from my experience is to have a closer look at what's problematic in the ways that we discuss and approach well-being in general and in family care partnering. So to organize this meaningfully, I've chosen myths, milestones, and moments as a way to highlight these experiences. And there was so much content developed in preparation, so I hope you'll come back at another time for a workshop or a retreat to dive in deeper at another time. So for now, a good place to begin is with the experience of our own lives. So your life, considering the poll of who's in the room, we have a little bit of a sense of one another. So here as a composite, we'll do something a little deeper here with the next poll, which is adding more depth into your own perspective. So if you would please have a look at the next poll, which contains 3 questions: a look back, a present moment perspective, and a little hunch about the future. And if you need to, you can just scroll along the side to see the 3rd question. And with only 4 options, just the encouragement not to overthink it. It's just a bird's eye view. And so Erin, thank you for posting this, and we'll hold on the results for now. We'll just sit with it, and perhaps you too will sit with your answers as this comes into view for you, and let it simmer here while I share a little more about the Wellness Initiative. So to begin, some more context. There are so many ways to discuss and approach caregiver well-being, and it always gives me pause in preparing for a presentation about what I do and what I love to do in this work, and most importantly, about the experiences I'm quite privileged to witness, to listen to support, and to learn from. And well-being, as we all know, is a big deal. This is a huge topic because the quality of our lives hangs in the balance of our ability to cope, and perhaps never more clear than in the past year. For all of us, no matter why you're here today, there's some important common ground here that wasn't shared before, in my opinion, collectively in the same way before the pandemic. And this is quite profound, I mean, for all of us to move through a shared trauma, and that's still unfolding. So most of us, I will say, live a life that we can enjoy, even in hardship, and to do so with resilience, and to be able to experience connection and pleasure, fulfillment, and insert your own deep felt longings here, whatever words, life or what's hard, the unexpected, the challenges, perhaps even the tragic and disappointing, but rather because it is. And being mature adults, though we may want to escape through our lives at times, we know it's inevitable. And it can scare us. And I think that we can all appreciate the ways in which we've been scared. And this is a normal response to a situation that threatens our sense of security. And it's complicated, and we have a tendency to make what's complicated more complicated and harder for ourselves when we're experiencing distress. And oftentimes in ways we can't quite put our finger on initially, and it's not easy to solve, particularly when it's chronic or pervasive, like having the symptoms of dementia or being a care partner through dementia, through a pandemic. So less about seeking the right solutions and more about seeking more responsive, adaptive, and resilient behaviors to difficulty. So we can have a life that has room for both. the difficulty, and the enjoyment. So if you've attended a previous event or have been involved in the center in other ways, you may know that the MADC is committed to memory and aging research, clinical care, education, and wellness. The history here is that the Wellness Initiative began in 2012, which is when I began my work here, and which is why I wanted to work here, the opportunity to develop continuous programming through the many years of caregiving and being in service and relationship with this vibrant community of dementia caregivers and individuals with dementia over the past 20 odd years. This has changed me. It's changed me professionally and who I am personally. And I've learned how important well-being and what self-care really is. It has become a way of living. So meeting the unexpected as best we can with resilience and compassion. And what I've noticed, because it's such vulnerable, exposing, tender work to walk through the fire of living with a dementia and being a partner to someone with dementia, care partner, caregiving, it will change you over and over again, transformed and rebuilding a life, and challenge you to reinvent yourself and your relationship with yourself and others. And this is why it's so important to have continuous programming and programming that reflects different experiences that will resonate at different times and at varying levels of commitment. So 10 years now of building programs alongside and with caregivers. And at the heart of each is the recognition of how everyday, momentary, often mundane choices and nudges towards our well-being and our own future, and how to self-regulate and tolerate the inevitable stressors of caregiving is really the key. How we move through the activation of our stress responses, how we meet perceived threats, real and imagined, and how this becomes part of navigating the uncertainty of dementia care, of living with the symptoms of being a care partner, like living through a pandemic, living with dementia. So what's really driving the program design here is the purpose. As you saw on the previous slide, there are programs that are monthly, there are programs that are weekly, there are programs that are intensive 8 weeks, there are day-long programs, there are invitations to do self-guided programming for care partners at any place in their pathway, as well as now with Mitten Minds, an opportunity for individuals who've been diagnosed to be in partnership and community together. And I will share again more about this later, but to give a snapshot of what this means. So what's really driving all of this program design is the purpose. Wellness programming is often misunderstood as only a way for caregivers to escape, to relax, and to feel good. And while this is also perhaps pleasurable at times, and it's part of the well-being experience, it's not the purpose. We need to be able to stand in our lives and in our lives as they are and as we are. So to continue to grow and to learn and respond and heal, which is different from avoiding, fixing, delaying, and denying. And the hard truth is we will do all of these things, and that's normal. That's being human, and it's also part of well-being and really intrinsic to the care partnering experience. So the difference is in how conscious we are of this pendulum, how capable and confident we are in responding to the swing, to the waves, or the complete dunking at times that we may feel. So looking at this list of what I hope you will understand about the Wellness Initiative, from your seat and from your life experience, what stands out to you? It'll be different based on who's here in the room, but really to bring attention to how the skills of well-being are among the very hardest to hone and to practice, and they're foundational for living well, and there's life to live. So it's a wise place to begin again and again. And the meaning again of the continuous programming, that there's always somewhere to return to do the hard work of restoration and maintenance and growth. And with a lot of forgiveness and self-compassion, because it's so hard to begin again without the shame and guilt. And we'll talk more about this. And to add to this experience, to say, for most of us, most of the time, things aren't emergent. We aren't addressing emergencies all the time, though there may be emergencies, and there frequently are in caregiving that happen, and also times of acute intensity. It's not a continual crisis. though our bodies can feel that way. Our minds can feel this way day by day. So most of the time, it's the challenge of responding to what's mundane, to what's ordinary, though profoundly different from how we may want it to be, or profoundly different from how we would have lived if we weren't a care partner, if we weren't caregiving, if we weren't living with the symptoms of dementia. So there is some painful reckoning here in the comparing. So how about now, we'll take a closer look at the results. Thank you, Erin, for posting. The snapshot of all of us here. So we'll look again at why we're here, who you are, and the next poll on experiences. So somewhat confident, and what this means to you personally. I'm going to scroll down here and look. So really, overall, feeling somewhat confident, uncertain about how to prioritize, perhaps. And then the confident about anticipating needs of the next few months. Let's just hold this as really interesting and also hopeful. There's a lot here. Thank you for doing that. So depending on your own timeline, you may or may not have seen your timeline snapshot, your own well-being pathway reflected in the poll, in what looked like the trend or the norm for this group at this time, which does not mean in any way or negate, minimize your lived experience. It's true. All of these are true. And sometimes we feel badly when we don't fit a particular picture of well-being. And just like caregivers and how care partners feel, it's hard not to compare. And there are personal reasons for this, highly subjective, as well as reasons that are absolutely not our fault, not your fault, out of control, though we may and frequently internalize them as our fault. And this is important when we're speaking about care partnering. So as we're on the cusp here, before we leap into the myths, the milestones, and the moments, just a brief look at some of the out of our control barriers that we reckon with. Just a few. And I'm calling them toxic intentionally because they are. These can really disrupt well-being. And you can see from the top, there are politics here. Until the resources are available to all families caring for an adult with dementia are equitable, quality, and accessible, it is deeply political. The well-being of caregivers is politicized. It's reflected and clear as day in our policies, and it's deeply flawed. And we've come a long way. Both are true. It's quite hopeful, like your own projections of the future, and yet we do need to reckon with the presence of these barriers in our life, publicly, privately. So added to this, culturally, the wellness sector, well-being, when we talk about these words, in the American public, which caregiver well-being is deeply impacted by, has monetized off the fear and emotions of scared and vulnerable people. And I have a lot to say about that, and perhaps you do too, and care deeply about what this means for how we go forward in supporting caregivers. So while this isn't the focus today, it's important, I feel, to recognize them, to see how they influence our health and our connections and our disconnections. And it's the water we all swim in. So looking at your own poll results for your confidence, looking back, looking at now, looking at the future, and now taking a look at this list of toxic barriers, perhaps those that aren't on this list or any others that are out of your control and well-being. Were there any that impacted your quality of life over the past year? And to be more specific, perhaps even those outside of the larger shared struggle of social distancing and masks and other precautions, any other barriers that felt deeply personal, like it was something you were doing wrong. And just noticing that, being aware. So this is where I find that Desmond Tutu's quote is really on point, going upstream to find out why. So the myths. Well, starting with the myths, going forward in our brief time together, I know we can explore, and you know we can explore all the domains of well-being and what this might look like in an individual life, or what well-being looks like for everyone, but you can consider this for yourselves. So as we move forward, just considering how most mental health and well-being related concerns and treatment come down to feeling safe, to feeling secure, and it comes down to regulating stress arousal. It comes down to satisfying relationships. And these are vastly more challenging in dementia care, though not impossible, not at all. It's quite possible. So we begin now at the generous voice of Joan.
When you start to notice changes in behavior with somebody you've been living with for a very long time, you have certain expectations about how that interaction and that relationship is going to work. And when you start to see changes that don't fit with the person that you've known all those years, for instance, not initiating as many things as they have in the past of joint kinds of things, or reacting in an upset and angry way, which is out of character for them, it causes you to feel angry and not valued by that person. And so you have that initial reaction. And what mindfulness does is gives you a sense to, you have a choice about how do you respond. Are you going to respond to those new behaviors, or are you going to stop and observe and take some time to reflect and start to figure out what's going on and see how that might change what's happening. And that's a whole process that doesn't take place in a day.
Thank you, Joan. So the first myth, reframed here as a harmful untruth, that there is somehow a best way to be a caregiver, and yet we think about the different styles and approaches. So this idea of this idealized caregiver who doesn't struggle, and that those who continue to struggle perhaps are doing something wrong. And while I think we all recognize this isn't true, and we may support other care partners in our lives and consider this, it's really hard for the individual to reckon with this, not just as a thought, but really as an embodied sense of confidence. So we can appreciate how caregiving is so nuanced and dynamic. And it comes down to skillful ways to respond and unskillful and reactive ways. And again, we do both, but how we recover and return. So what persists and drives behaviors really depends on our awareness and our flexibility. And if you participate in other talks before and in this series, you'll know that last month, Amanda Leggett presented on her research in caregiver styles. And if you haven't, I hope you'll go check it out. It's on the MADC YouTube page. It's excellent. And this is recent research, and she's actually recruiting right now for COVID styles of caregiving in the midst of the pandemic. So if that interests you as well. Very useful information. And here's why. Because of all the varying ways that care partners can engage in what they do in relationship, focusing less on the right or the wrong, but the nuance of behavior and how adaptive things are, appreciating all the different kinds of styles and seeing them for their benefits and their drawbacks, but also knowing here that we can tailor interventions more skillfully as clinicians, but also the way we talk about care partnering can be more helpful and mobilize different resources when we have understanding of caregiving styles. So really appreciate the work she's doing here at U of M. So just a note here, considering your own lives without judgment, without any criticism, perhaps we're not all this way all the time. We're not always curious. We're not always flexible, but we can look gently towards where we may be increasing harm, even for ourselves, with our struggle, to look at it from a step back and having a curiosity here too about grieving styles and wellness styles. No one right way. So for all of you who answered the poll, the many ways that we approach our own health and well-being. So let's take another look here. So I mentioned threat appraisal. And Joan, in her description of her own partnership with her husband, highlighted the experience of anger arising, which family caregivers, all of us, naturally can hold some shame and guilt around. And it's also really informed by how we're socialized and prepared to express and cope with the anger in our lives. So I really appreciate the work of Dr. Peter Levine and Dr. Dan Siegel to understand the brain and body reactions following adversity or trauma, change, threats. And you may recognize Dan Siegel's work. He's the director of the Mindsight Institute and a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA. So in this infographic, just do an overlay of your own life and what you were doing in your look back. So this hyperarousal, window of tolerance, hypoarousal. So outside of those words, where that pendulum is in our ability to cope, what resonates with you throughout the past year, or perhaps even this week. Perhaps there's something right now that you're feeling, that you're swinging through, feeling a little insecure, perhaps some anxious thoughts, or really the embodied experience of anxiety, or a little bit of dissociating, a distance and numbness. We have our ways that we cope, and in the body's intelligence, it's trying very hard to regulate us. So an even closer look here, the settled and unsettled. So alongside this beautiful infographic, I really appreciate it, this window of tolerance, which is also the river of resilience, we have a healthy nervous system shown here for ourselves. So this threat appraisal, our own bodies, as an example from care partnering, when we hear, for example, repetitive questioning rounds, it can increase our own irritability and agitation in ourselves. And so we pendulate to being able to respond. And the brain is really smart, how it protects when it feels a perceived threat. And in other moments, perhaps repetitive questioning isn't a problem at all. So just staying really interested in what are the conditions in which this happens and our confidence and ability to meet it. So it's a profound and paradoxical phenomenon in caregiving and how over time, the smallest of changes can feel like a huge threat, not consciously even. And consciously though, even we might be aware that, okay, we're spinning out, we're spiraling, or we're numbing. But having a deeper insight into the mechanisms and the ability to regulate, to interrupt the escalation effectively, which Joan was speaking about. So one more step, going deeper here, attending to the reactivity. So looking at this, here we have a traumatic event or a stressful event. And trauma is the response, not the event. So it's how we're responding to what occurred. So thinking about your own experience, and in that river of resilience and that window of tolerance, that's that range, we can be stuck on, or we can be stuck off. Really so removed, worn down, depressed, lethargic. This is fear, going numb, hyper-aroused, restless, agitated, stuck in worry, inability to sleep. Think about your own stress symptoms as well. For all of us, to what immediately comes up when you're stressed in your body, and perhaps what shows up and hangs around long term. So this is where the skills of well-being and doing wellness activities communicate safety to the body. How we rest and return to our security in the moment. Our styles and differences are okay. The question is, are they functional in the river of resilience? Adrenaline is not needed most of the time to solve a problem. And yet when we're overactivated in either pole, that's what's going to show up. So by the time I see caregivers, they're often a few years in, and this experience of stuckness in one of these zones. This is oversimplified, but just a quick look at stress and stress reduction. Just like those poles of stuck on and stuck off, grossly here, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system are working to regulate us. We can be checked out or overly activated in both. But understanding how this works is useful just to identify our own stress, because it's embodied. It's not just in the mind. Self-care often resides here more in activating intentionally the parasympathetic nervous system. And self-care practices, like mindfulness, or really what this means is awareness, activates our body to respond. It brings it more on board in healthy ways. It's a habit, which tends to get crowded out when we are engaged in our autopilot or we're overstimulated with stress. So I wanted to spend a few more time on this particular myth and look at this out of the gate to establish this kind of language that we'll use throughout. And a meditation teacher, a colleague and professional of mine that we did training together years ago with John Kabat-Zinn, he's also an author now. He has this wonderful quote, which I think is apropos to the time we're in. Training yourself to be with and relax into small amounts of discomfort every day is like a psychological vaccination against the bigger stressors of life. Pretty relevant, so how confident you may feel in spaces where just a few months ago you would have been quite anxious or really nervous because now you may be vaccinated. So it is a broad metaphor here, but a similar line of thinking applied to your own habits of well-being and threat appraisal. And just a note here about what I mean and what we are pointing towards in confidence and why this matters. The thing about building confidence is that it's related to control, and it shows up in the research is really quite important for stress reduction. We all like control, but more we like to feel agency, right? It's that stress resilience, this ability to be able to regulate and to pendulate. Can I find my way back in a difficult moment? Can I deal with high-end activation? So back to the threat appraisal, if the perceived challenge is within your ability to handle it, and it will feel less stressful. So more like a challenge that you can rise to the occasion, that you can rise to rather than sinking your boat in the river of tolerance. Just pausing here to look at what resonates with you, and ultimately how we can feel and return to being okay. All right. So another brief poll, how we manage and regulate. This comes from the work of Rick Hansen on strength and styles. Learning through challenge. So Rick Hansen is a neuropsychologist, educator, and author, really looking at happiness, but through adversity. So thank you for taking the poll. We'll just pause on the results for a minute to do the first inquiry I mentioned. How are you doing out there? Okay. So just a brief shift, have a little bit of practice in this hour together. So if you would please, the invitation to just take note of where you are. Maybe you've been on your screen all morning, or you just arrived here for this webinar. Just take a look around. So part of security is actually just being aware of where you actually are. And if you're interested, and if it feels comfortable for you, just an invitation. This way, it just needs your attention inward rather than on the screen. So just for a few moments. And I'll be asking you 3 questions. So together, just dropping attention inward, if closing your eyes is comfortable, and allowing your attention and awareness to move to where you feel support and contact in your body with your chair, with the floor beneath your feet, So rather than thinking about these places, just really feeling into any pressure and support, the full length of your body, how you're seated, perhaps even the opportunity to release more, to release muscles that aren't needed for being seated the way you're seated, in the shoulders or the neck, the hips, your face. And just shifting attention to awareness of breathing. You've been breathing this whole time. This way we can just be attuned to the next breath more intentionally without having to change it at all, just noticing how it feels, where you feel it most easily. And perhaps an awareness of what's changed in your mind or your body, your breath since we started. If you're sleepy or alert or caffeinated or not caffeinated enough. And important here is to be aware of what feels just fine, what's okay, what's neutral, kind of related to those mundane moments that are easy to ignore, just really taking in what's okay. So somewhere in your body that feels secure and just fine, and how you know it, how it feels. And from here, just considering this first question, think about one clear and specific obstacle to your well-being that occurred during the pandemic, during 2020. And it may not have been related to the pandemic at all. I just really call this to mind, something in your well-being, a perceived obstacle, something that was real, but how this impacted your well-being, something that you perceived as a real setback for yourself. We won't stay with it very long, just a bird's eye view, once you can name it. And if you would please, just describe it briefly to keep it really concise for now. Just jot down 5 adjectives or so to describe the experience. I put this slide up. And you can stay with it. You can stay here with your eyes closed if you like, or if you're someone who likes to write things down and this is helpful, just encourage you to do that. Or maybe you just really enjoy sitting with your eyes closed and following your breath and listening. It's a great way to listen. The webinar format allows us to do this. So just jotting these down. So not to get carried away with this thought, just looking at it curiously. Sometimes I think about looking at it like the way if you found a letter in the parking lot on the way to your car, sort of a, what's this? Intrigue, but it's your own life, right? So taking a refreshing breath, another question. How are you experiencing this now? What is this setback that you remember? How is it experienced today in your life as it is now? Very much in the same way you looked at confidence over the past, what it feels like now, and your projection into the future. Another opportunity to write down a couple of words, some adjectives perhaps about what the experience is now. And then a consideration, reflecting on this for a moment, how you traveled between the two, from the first experience to arrive at the second. How this may be playing out in your life at this time, and how you describe it today. It's interesting. So without needing to really analyze it, but just to see it. When things return to neutral, we tend to move on so quickly, we don't really see it, or an opportunity to look at the nuance of how it's changed, because this does inform our sense of what's next, beginning with the next moment, which informs our decisions, our behaviors, the lens for how we see our lives. And absolutely, our care exchanges and the way we are in relationship to the people in our care, beginning with how we care for ourselves. All right, so just noticing what came up. So here's the answer. Erin, if you want to post the poll, you can, but I grabbed the entire section here from Rick Hansen, which I thought was really helpful. So it's a third. A third of our strengths are innate, but 2/3 we can really influence. And this is promising. This is hopeful. I love the answers, right? It's really hard to know. So let this be reassurance from a researcher, from someone who really studies the mind, behavior, presence, and well-being through trauma, through change, through uncertainty, that we have a lot of control, actually. And how we then find meaning through what can feel like the meaningless, a pathway. So entering now into the next myth. When we look at all the changes, there is loss, there is grieving that is happening. And one of the myths that persists in our culture is that the time for grieving in dementia care particularly, is that it's for later. That it's a later stage issue or after the death of a loved one. And this simply isn't true. And it actually is quite harmful to caregivers. They can't see themselves reflected back. We often see significant distress for caregivers before diagnosis. So this sense of grieving happening at a specific time in a particular way is not only not useful, it causes great harm. So back to the toxic barriers. And overall, our country is really strange in conversations about death and dying and aging. And we have some unfortunate disruptive expectations. So prior to coming to the MEDC, I facilitated for many years groups for the newly diagnosed and individuals who hadn't even received a diagnosis yet. And, they were very much in a grief process, trying to regulate as well through all of the changes that weren't reflected in the sensitivity of the clinical measures that were even present to do the diagnoses. So we've arrived now where most clinicians understand and recognize that grieving starts at the time of diagnosis is what is affirmed, but we know that this goes much farther back. So the way we define it matters. The pain of losing partnership, relationship, and changes in anticipation as well. So I've named them here. It's another conversation. Anticipatory grief, ambiguous loss, and the loss of one's old life. And I call it a ghost life, right? There's a shadow here, the experience that would have been, how we would be, how we should be, the life I'd be having. We need to include this in our therapeutic process and in the language. Otherwise, it's invisible, and caregivers, again, are responding to something that's out of their control. This is the truth of walking through dementia care. I hope that as we proceed in the years to come, that we'll even have more nuanced descriptions of grieving. And this will be so helpful and nurturing for helping each other along the way through life for all of us, particularly for caregivers who are moving through dementia. A brief look at the grief cycle. Many of us might be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model, and here it is kind of displayed as, the dip here being depression. It's useful to look at this. They're helpful, but that's not what it looks like. These are my squiggles. I don't know how your squiggle would look. It's all over the place, and we really need to affirm this. Additionally, too, is the what I mentioned earlier about meaning making, about finding meaning. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's successor, one of her mentees, is David Kessler, and he recently came out with a book called Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief, and you might want to check it out. Really quite beautiful. So now the voice of Julie.
someone will say, how is he doing? And he's, I often might say, he's blissfully unaware, and it's okay. And I'm adjusting to that. I've grieved my dad, our relationship, and how it's changed and navigated, someone.
So to affirm here what Julie was saying, the work is with her. In this instance, not being able to grieve with him. So the work is resting solely on the care partner, just to acknowledge that. This is another model, which I appreciate. It's the dual process model of grieving. We have life bouncing through the middle. Think about that river of tolerance, the river of resilience, and the window of tolerance. How you move through life and what's happening here in orientation and reorientation. Being distracted from grieving, moving away from grieving, and then coming back into the waves, perhaps unexpected, of grief, confronting grief, the intrusion, sometimes of grief, how it shows up in other ways. Like Joan was saying earlier, it can show up very much like anger and frustration, trying to regulate the stuck on and stuck off. So you can see here, actually in quite protective and meaningful ways, denial, anxiety, they can also be useful. So they're not always bad, they're helping to protect. And when we look at them this way, we cannot dismiss them as bad, but as signs of opportunities, as flags for well-being. So currents of sorrow run beneath daily life and care partnering. And potentially here, if left unexplored, it robs a care partner of their joy. And the river of tolerance floods. So a note here about post-traumatic growth. I think this is really quite important. Who are you becoming now? What new insight, what newness is going to emerge from this loss? So it's not about trying to find a positive spin or moving through. It's about the deeper experience, the pain, and it's not the whole story. So the third myth, caregiving as an identity. We say this when we are in groups and people reintroduce themselves, they'll say, I'm a caregiver. And of course that's true. It's true, and caregiving is completely relational. It is what you do in relationship. It's a way of responding to that particular dynamic in relationship. It is care partnering. And when we identify with caregiving in this way, we risk losing essential parts of ourselves. And when we can't see or prioritize or keep in view these parts of ourselves, our resilience and well-being can teeter. We have a distance from ourselves. We look at this as enmeshment too. It's a normal thing to happen. It's quite common, and it's what we will be working with over time as it shows up many times. So the other caveat of this is that a care partner is also at risk of personalizing the symptoms. If I'm a good caregiver, these symptoms shouldn't happen. The fact that they're declining is my fault. So it's inescapable, but it brings up a sense of inadequacy consistently. Another threat. So again, a threat appraisal and an inescapable attack if we're over-identified this way. So more threats to stability, to security, more insecurity, less confidence, less space to be a fuller being. And you are needed, care partners who are in the room today, in your fullness, in your whole lives. So the milestones. Milestones, they're key events in all of our lives. We recognize this word, and many are acknowledged culturally and upheld as really a worthy life, right? We'll have these things, and yet that gets tricky because we have anticipated milestones, but these milestones that we hold culturally may not be met by care partners and individuals with dementia because of the losses. And that's huge, feeling outside of life in that way. So I'd like to talk about different milestones because we can tend to idealize these rites of passage instead of acknowledging the very much real and worthy and important, heroic pathways that caregivers and individuals with dementia live through their own milestones. So I'm reframing this through a well-being lens today, having a look at these 3 milestones, which are more personal, and they're personal breakthroughs for caregivers. And they're individual, and yet these are common ones, enough to be explored and important to emphasize here. So the first, recognizing the personal path, much like the grieving pathway, has no clear stages. We recognize how in dementia clinical care, there's staging. And it's useful for research. It's useful in a broad clinical sense to helping to anticipate what might happen and what has been with millions of people, very common in what we frame as, degenerative and decline. But this is not the path of a caregiver. They're not symmetrical. And yet it can default this way. Care needs are changing. The needs of the caregiver are distinct and separate. And understanding this is so critical because the way we talk about it, it changes the way a caregiver moves through their world with confidence and tolerance. And one way this is helpful is how it quiets the comparing mind, the anxiety of, is this normal? The self-talk that erodes confidence, mental health, and clear thinking. So considering what is normal for a care partner here, anticipating losses, the experience of being on their own path, and the socially reinforced expectations and biases. And these are secondary losses to the actual diagnosis, but that's where many care partners are living and adapting to these changes that they're responsible for over time. So it gives us a different way of looking through what's really a cyclical experience, not linear. And maybe you have another metaphor or image for your own experience. So here's Mary really speaking to this point.
I thought I had to be there every single day and on top of it. And in the case of he was in a memory care, I needed to let others help much more than I was. So the forced 19 days gave me kind of released the guilt and said, it's okay, I don't go every day. And so after that, I didn't go every day. I went, every couple days. And it made a world of difference in my health and my mental state and how I interacted with him. And I think I was a much more patient, gentle person after that.
Well, thank you to Mary. So this link here between the caregiver path and the important milestone of being able to hold a boundary, of really standing in what is best for you, which may or may not be synchronous with the feedback you're getting from even other family members, from friends, from experts. You're the expert. So input into care decisions and exchanges. So how can this be sourced from a place of knowing that's what's best for you? And how can you really stand there protectively and kindly for yourself? Just as Mary was describing, it took the pandemic and the protocols to keep her from going. And yet she discovered something profoundly important for her well-being and for her partner in that process. So again, it goes back to this skill of being able to move through. We get caught in being reactive and over deep concern and love for doing the right thing. And yet we can discover with a little more objectivity, with a little more calm, how we can move confidently and also with some permission. No one else is going to give us the permission to hold this. And an important note here, how the arrival of guilt and shame, frustration and agitation in ourselves, are flags for self-care and being really curious about them. Red flags, green flags, and those neutral, okay, mundane places, orange flags. These are perhaps the most important for well-being, and we tend to just blaze right past them. So being self-determined, you get to decide. It's liberating and it's also scary. And the more familiar it is, the easier it is to hold. So here's Mary again.
Be kind to yourself, don't judge yourself. And what you're doing is the best you can do. And so it's okay. And so that, I think, just brings a different level of perspective that's easy to lose sight of when you're in the midst of true chaos as a caregiver at times, and so much ambiguity and so much uncertainty, that just focusing right now on today, because that's all you can deal with, really help. Be kind to yourself.
How? So we may know what to do. We may understand this conceptually. We really get ourselves that way. We may even see our patterns, and sometimes it's easier for others to point out these patterns for us, an uncomfortable thing for sure, even in the best of relationships. So a note here about a milestone of really seeing and developing that impartial witness, that part of ourselves that can be kind of over looking at the window of tolerance, who can work through these experiences rather than getting caught up in them. And of course we will, but we may catch them sooner. So seeing things more clearly and skillfully, being able to reinterpret these red flags, green flags, orange flags, leaning into the orange flags, as I mentioned before. Because stress is embodied, and this is embodied as well for resilience. It's a home base, and it's easier to navigate and find our way home when we're activated and triggered, when we're familiar with the pathway. So the same way, trying to give an example here, that we read the signs of the weather, we don't personalize the weather, do we? If it's a wedding day or if we're a farmer, it depends how we look at this. So it's a way to see based on the moment. But self-care isn't an emergency response. This is daily, tiny habits, subtle choices and processes. So this way we can interpret and see our red flags and green flags. And one more note here before we move to moments. What is the purpose or the goal here? When the body gets activated, this is our opportunity to find a way to communicate with our body and mind, to feel into these cues of safety, into that river of resilience as a practice. Moments. So reflecting again on your own experience and what influences your confidence. It's informed by where you are. So being attuned and responding to what's actually happening versus what we think will happen, getting caught up in anticipating, being certain about it, been here, done that, what's expected and what's assumed. And this is really hard as a care partner because we're using the changing dynamics and symptoms that we've experienced as a way to respond to for safety, internally and externally, to what's coming next. And so we risk overlaying what's happened before as a way of being certain it will happen again. And that's not always the case. It can be part of the way that we approach and respond to what's happening. So most care exchanges being ordinary, which makes them vulnerable to being in this reactive autopilot, particularly when we are operating in that stuck on or stuck off and we're outside our window of tolerance. So here, being attuned to what's happening in the moment, we can respond to the person in front of us because we're really responding first to ourselves. This is dependent on our ability to be present. And that way, in a few moments, in a second, or out of good habit, we can let go of our ideas of what should happen, what ought to happen, what needs to happen. Again, it's not usually an emergency. In most cases, we can influence the outcome and reduce harm. So even, and most importantly, right in the midst of something really difficult, not escaping, but right through the difficult moment. And here, this is actually the practice of well-being. We're building connection, confidence, and calm in the moment counterintuitively to what we would normally think. We want to get away from it. Our body may want to run away from it. And just being aware of that and being familiar with how that feels in your body. The sooner the better, of course. So here's Sandy giving some insight into this experience.
So I think that I became, and it was a combination of things, not just Laura, but I became more living in the present, and I was thinking less about what was ahead, because as far as my husband's concerned, I had no idea what was ahead and there was no way to know. And I think that affected my entire life, because I just realized that I can't determine what's ahead. And so I just need to pay attention to what's happening right then. That was definitely part of my my growth and my learning. And then not to have expectations. I had so many expectations for myself, as well as expectations of what our marriage was going to be like going to the end. And all of that changed. So learning that I needed to not have expectations and I would be much calmer and happier. That was a big learning for me. So I think that
I've listened to the stories of care partners for many, many years, and it's always moving and profound to hear it again and again. And preparing for this presentation, there's something here. It opens another window in the window of tolerance to hear another care partner's experience, which is why peer groups are so powerful. And in this way, Sandy's inviting all of us to consider self-acceptance and self-compassion, as a foundation for our health and well-being. And when you think about your own journey, what influences your attitudes? Our healthy choices and decisions hinge on these and our perspective. So the greater likelihood to tolerate challenges here begins with seeing where we are. So our ability to apply self-acceptance and compassion. This way we're maximizing the benefits of self-care and reducing harm once again. So with so many losses and setbacks and caregiving, this is critical. And here is Glenn with his insights on what self-compassion means over many years. And I've known Glenn for 10 years. He has really been through thick and thin. So this is where this message is sourced from.
How to be self-compassionate, because it's really tough. You got to forgive yourself. You got to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and feel good about the fact that you can take care of yourself and not neglect your loved one. I've seen a lot of people almost they wear themselves out, and get to a point where they start having more medical problems because they're not taking care of themselves, and then they're not as helpful to their loved one in the caregiving scenario. How to be self-compassionate.
It's so hard in practice, which is why it requires pathways internally and out in the community to come back. So being able to prioritize self-care as part of daily structure until it's simply a way of being. It's intrinsically compassionate and forgiving. So this third moment. And these points too, over and over again, self-care as a security, as a secure foundation, and that it's not a reward system. Such a toxic, positive, toxic spin that we hear, that when I do this, I can get this. It just really exists from the time we're children to our relationships. So of course it's showing up in care partnering. And we do this to ourselves, no other relationship needed. So just questioning gently for yourself, where do you hold off on self-care as a reward? So not when you deserve it. You deserve it. In fact, it's critical for the kind of care that you want to provide. And it's the only way it's going to be sustainable. And it's the only way it's going to be quality. So this isn't grand gestures. It's so great. And I hope you will have deep respite, that you will take vacations, that you will plan for and have in your calendar things to look forward to and do for yourself. But it's back to the ordinary moments that are profound, each one a building block into our health. So tiny habits, subtle changes, discerning in the moment, what builds resilience, what's pulling us away, like the fibers in a strong fabric of your design, of your own design. So this is essential, and it requires a lot of patience, self-compassion, and remembering it's not an emergency response system. Right? This is foundational. Actually, when we're in an emergency, we're operating on a different system, and hopefully, like a parachute, our skills will show up. It's hard to rehearse for an emergency, and yet what becomes habit is more likely to be there. And trusting ourselves, that's another moment I would put on here if we had time, what trust means in caregiving. So another insight from Sandy.
The other thing was the little stop sign, and I laminated that on a stone, and I carried that in my pocket. And then every time I needed it, it was in my pocket, and I would feel it, and then I went through the 4 steps. That was a huge game changer too. My husband is now living in a memory care facility, and I'm able to go back and visit him again. And I always stop at the door and greet him so that before I'm right there in his face, and just do it naturally. Just approach someone slowly, I guess, is the key. The other thing was,
and we can all appreciate that when we really experience someone else's presence and how they approach us. So it's really the skills of quality relating. The challenge here is that it's really hard to stop ourselves. So unless it's a habit, it's not going to happen. And it's so mundane. Like, this is so every day, right? We even roll past stop signs literally in our cars. So what this means, and what Sandy was referring to, is stopping, taking a breath, observing, and proceeding. We can think of this as the welcome mat into that window of tolerance. We have to show up at the door first somehow. This is a simple way as a takeaway. And a little bit about what happens when we do that. The intention here, so that we can be more in touch with our stress reduction, to have a sense of confidence, or really the self-efficacy and agency as we move into whatever's next in relationship to our partners, and to decrease the frequency or the need for challenging behaviors. So frequently looking at the challenging behaviors of the person who is living with symptoms. Well, what about our own? Not to be critical or to be self-judging in any way, but this is what we need to reckon with first, before we can actually even see clearly any changes in another person. More opportunities for kindness, less reactivity. So how about for you, the importance of checking in with your own myths, milestones, and moments? Where do you know for yourself, with the same qualities that have been mentioned, with self-compassion, with patience and kindness, with that observing mind, the ability to look calmly? Where does autopilot show up? Are there any places where you're comparing yourself to another person? Do you have a tendency to ruminate about things that have already happened, or are you more likely to be thinking about the future and caught up anxiously there? Both are really helpful to know where our mind states tend to go, so that we can find ourselves there and walk ourselves gently back to the moment. And here we can decide about what might need to be attended to in future decision making, which is very different than getting caught up in that stuck on mode. Remaining curious and interested in your experience versus really defaulting to fixing, solving, and falling into autopilot. When we're stressed and overwhelmed, we really want the right answer. In fact, we would be willing to pay for someone to give us the right answer. We won't find it there. This, again, has a quality of trust to coming back, catching future-focused thoughts that run amok, and shifting to intentional planning and wise discernment, noticing our propensities, all of us, to live sometimes, maybe more frequently than we'd like, in our imagined scenarios. It helps us recalibrate. It helps us self-regulate. So recapping this as calm, caregiving, and living in the moment with this really means for showing up and how this can benefit the whole of your life in all of the ways that you live. Caregiving isn't compartmentalized. It overflows into everything, which for those who are in the room who are actively caregiving, you know this. So what do you see here for yourself? The purpose. It doesn't mean we're going to feel immediately calm. It does mean that we'll be able to escort ourselves back to a more compassionate and clear-seeing moment. That fostering well-being doesn't even require us to be calm in the moment. We can feel the difficulty, the agitation, the messiness, and still be aware. And from there, as Joan was saying, and Sandy, and Glenn, and Mary, that there we have the wheel, that 2/3 that Rick Hansen is talking about. That's where we can intervene consciously. These are pathways when we need it most, putting calm here into context. And it's a commitment. When we're more conscious of what's happening, we can then make a clearer choice. So as we wrap up, before moving on to descriptions of programming and taking a closer look at your questions, if you have any or responses, the second inquiry. Taking another breath, noticing how you are now. It's a lot of information. And of course, since I'm over here by myself, I'm doing all the talking. Although I anticipate too that you've had your own voice in your head. And if you would please, take another look around your room. The light may have changed. Where are you now? Maybe you're somewhere else. We've been all over the map, and I've been asking you to time travel in your own experience. So now let's practice coming back to where you are. If it's comfortable for you to close your eyes, just drop attention into your body. What do you notice now? Is there any restlessness or perhaps some settledness? Feeling into the places where you feel secure. It really is quite wonderful that we take for granted, and it's neutral, that we can feel secure right where we're seated. Feeling into any safety in our own body, noticing your feet, the length of your spine, the position of your shoulders, chin, taking an intentional breath and just feeling into what it means to be right here. And that's the nice thing about breathing. We can always come back to it because it's right here. We don't have to do anything. It brings us right back to where we are. Sounds are the same way. We can listen and hear the sounds in the room. There's so much happening in any given moment. The texture underneath your hands, if your hands are on your lap or resting on your chair. And from here, another 3 questions for you. Thinking about recalling one clear and specific success in your well-being during the pandemic. In 2020, to give a time frame, something really supportive and helpful that you did for yourself, a real gain, a success in your own well-being. What it looked like, what it was, what it felt like. And as you're familiar now, since you know a little bit about what to expect from the previous question, naming it. 5 adjectives or some title you would give it that's personal to you. Noticing what this feels like to really stay with it and bring it in. That we can purposefully take in the good. Whether you want to write these down, it's a worthwhile exercise. Perhaps come back to it sometime later today. But for now, just noticing what you're experiencing in this well-being success that you achieved and lived with and through. What is it like now, today, for you? What does it mean now? What was significant? What still lingers, perhaps, how it informs you. And naturally, we're moving into how you traveled from the first experience to arrive at the second. So consider your perspective and your perception on this well-being success. Both were true, the setback and the success. And curiously, what do we tend to spend more time on? What takes up more real estate in our brain and our attention? Taking in the successes is really important. It matters when it comes to building daily. Our awareness of the orange flags and our ability to locate this window of tolerance for ourselves. So ultimately, this is resilience. And whether you want to keep your eyes closed and stay there for a moment, what does it mean to be resilient in your own life? And this image, beautiful image provided by Ashley Miller, who is our wellness coordinator, who leads Mitten Minds. So thinking of it like a tree, I think all of us are quite attuned to nature right now. We are appreciating it more vividly since we've had so much time to pay more attention to it. It's always there. It's the real thing going on. So thinking of the top branches as every day, these leaves, minutes of peace or respite or reconnection, even through difficulty. And that the trunk, this vascular system of the trees, much like our own nervous system, sort of looks like the nervous system that we operate on unconsciously and consciously. The renewal and reset, when we have a little more time to really get into these practices and the roots, right? The lasting impact, these deep sources of nutrients and support, where we get deep fuel for our courage. And like any tree through a storm, we've had so much rain and storms. Maybe you've seen this in your neighborhood. We lost a huge oak, a beautiful 100-year oak across the street from our home. And for whatever reasons, it just couldn't withstand the winds. It gave way. So when we think about our strength and stability, we need to be able to be flexible, not rigid. And having these practices gives us a sense of resilience. Whatever metaphor works for you, I find this helpful. So the last poll, moving into what we know about the caregiver population, and the caregiver population is broad. If you would take a look at this poll. So the population that is caregiving for older adults, and the population that is caregiving for adults with a dementia. There are differences here. So what percentage do you feel is more substantial emotional, financial, and physical difficulties, more than their non-dementia caregiving peers? And we'll come back to that, and feel free to post that whenever it's available. Erin, thank you. So here's another interesting fact from the research. This comes from the AARP U of M collaboration on the National Poll of Healthy Aging. So talking about that lived experience of the window and tolerance and stress and rewards. So fascinating. We don't talk about this enough. 78% of caregivers saying it was stressful, and 85% saying caregiving was rewarding. Very or somewhat, both and. So what's happening here, right? I'm curious about this, and I can see how this works in the programs. Research like Amanda Leggett's points towards styles. Can we take in all of it? And at what cost? Are we minimizing harm? What are we moving through? And seeing how this resonates for you, the joys and the sorrows, the stress and the rewards. You can look at this report online. Just Google the National Poll on Healthy Aging. And another important source of information, if you are interested in the facts and figures, they're compelling. And back to the toxic barriers, really taking a deeper dive into where we see institutional racism and discrimination in this field as well. It's a responsibility and important for all of us in allyship to be aware, so we can be better advocates for ourselves, for our families, and for those who are in this with us, whether we see them or not. It will take all of us. So the programs here, so much is available to you online. Another part of the research was that there was only 28% of caregivers who were utilizing the resources available to them in their community. That's worrisome. But part of it may be the ways in which we are welcoming. It may be the ways in which the modality works for their time and schedule. There's so many reasons. So we're doing our best to respond as best we can to the barriers we identify and to make this always a place to return to. So important note I want to make about Calm Connections, which is the topic today. We've been building a website, an interactive self-guided program for care partners who can't either attend programming or who would like to take an additional self-guided tour through these topics. And this is coming soon. The website is being built. As you heard, the sound bites of caregivers. It is resourced with stories and insights, practices and encouragements, really clear modules on different themes, resources, and opportunities for practice. Built on, going back to the previous slide, built on catching your breath. It's a monthly program. So the material there will be there for you to guide yourself through over time. So we're used to sitting down with an education curriculum and getting in like one bite, sort of our achievement, absorb, process, and then put it in place. But we know now, and hopefully too after the end of this hour and a half, that this is a practice. As Joan had said, it doesn't happen overnight. So building it out, these modules, with the intention that you will revisit it over time. And of course, coming back, because each content area will look differently as your caregiving context changes. So not as repetition, but as rediscovery, be really building out and revisiting where you actually are. So I hope you'll find us on the web, look through the programs that are online, as well as feeling free to email me and reach out directly. But registration for all of these is on our registration page. And we invite you. And this something new to our groups here that will be emerging soon as an invitation is the Living Grief program, as we are building out programming to talk about anticipated grieving, ambiguous loss, as well as having an opportunity to look at the grieving process that is specific to care partners who have loved and cared for someone for many years with dementia. As far as we can see, there aren't any specific groups like that, sadly, in our area or in the country. So we are hoping to create inroads there and more opportunities, and welcome you to join us in helping us meet this need and learn the best ways to do this. So I put in repetition purposefully in my presentations. This is familiar. We have worked through all of these steps together and talked about what they might mean for you personally and for the broader caregiving population, what kindness and calm means, and considering all the facets discussed today, what's in line with your intention to support yourself as ongoing work and practice. A note about caregiver studies. These are also on our page. It's very exciting. Just 5 years ago, these didn't exist. This is thrilling for me. If we don't have caregivers in the research, we can't respond and advocate in the public. So before we go into your questions and answers, feel free to jot them in there. I have one statement that I want to make before we move on. And just to say again, how we understand and how I understand we can't secure a better healthcare system for caregivers and individuals and dementia only through calm practices and meditation alone. However, it's a form of advocacy. Calm, present, and kind people are powerful and help usher in change. So beginning right where we are in our own homes and in the privacy and intensity of care exchanges and interactions with the people we love, we create and live our lives. So sometimes we feel angry and despondent, and that's okay. We also need to be comfortable with these hard feelings like anger and learn how to work with them to usher in the kind of change that we need for all of us in our private lives and in the larger systems which impact all caregivers and families living through the impact of dementia. I really appreciate you being here and listening as I learn to be on time. It's so hard. Thank you. I'll pause here for questions and responses. And thank you, Erin, for managing behind the scenes. Really appreciate it. I can go here in the chat, I think. Oh, thank you.
believe I've been trying to answer a lot of the questions as we
Thank
go.
you.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A box. Either one will do.
Yes, and I want to make a note about how we're really encouraging everyone who attends our wellness programs to also be in touch with a support group that's specific to where they're caregiving. It may be through the Alzheimer's Association or another group. We have a Lewy body dementia initiative, and this is so important to be resourced and understand your caregiving context, and we're happy to help you connect with that. What I would love to do another presentation on is really normalizing that journey we were talking about, the cycle of well-being and how this looks in terms of navigating resources. Because oftentimes, right after diagnosis, you're inundated with information, and that may not be the right time. So also building your tolerance for responding to the onslaught of shoulds, woulds, and coulds. Well-intended, but it's really hard. So here's a question: when you notice early signs in a family member, how do we confront or seek care when the person impacted is in total denial? This is a complicated question, and really knowing, but thank you for asking it gently. Denial may be there for a lot of reasons. It may be organic to the symptoms. It could be personality. It could be, as all of us appreciate as adults, a need to feel okay and safe and independent. Right? That's all. How we feel independent in our lives as adults has so much value, particularly as an American, right? We have this, and perhaps even worship of our autonomy, and that complicates things. So navigating this very thoughtfully to focus on shared desires for living the rest of life, and these are common grounds. So it's quite frequent that a discussion around how can we help you achieve what you want in terms of your independence and being able to step into it. That's a lot of family work. It can help to have a professional involved. And I will say, if a family meeting or having someone else step in, if there is a high risk of harm, or if that person is arrived at a place where their living situation is problematic, there are other risks, you will need more support through this so that you can create inroads to conversations to make safe choices. There's a lot here. So thank you for asking that question. Denial is useful, and yet it's also, the other part of this is being aware of what they are aware of. Where is the currency for discussing what matters to them? But this is likely, could be part of a pervasive communication pattern to be gentle towards. Thank you for asking. Do Alzheimer's and depression go hand in hand? So yes and no. The response to situational changes and the sort of organic changes that can happen, it's often part of early signs prior to any noticeable cognitive changes too. So it's individual, and yet we do see significant depression and anxiety in both the population that is living with Alzheimer's or another kind of dementia, as well as in caregivers. So these, again, not symmetrical experiences are at the same time, but it's quite common to see this. And yes, to your question, one leading to the other, and also present. It depends on personal history as well, but we should always be looking for it. We can treat the symptoms of depression as well, and anxiety. Yes, absolutely. And the research points towards increased depression and anxiety, increased depression in caregivers for many of the reasons we discussed. Getting overwhelmed, right? Not being able to meet the demands. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I wish I could stay longer to talk about how this shows up. But to really, thankfully, this information is also available at your fingertips to begin there, and welcome you to come to programming. Thank you so much for your inquiries, for being willing to go along with me through the polls and everything else. Appreciate your feedback too. I'll pass this back to Erin for final announcements here.
Yes. All right, thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you enjoyed. We have the date here for our next speaker series. Oh, it looks like that date is actually incorrect at the top. That's today, but it is in August. We probably just forgot to swap that over. More information on our website. Also, depending on how you found out about this event, we'll be sending emails and our e-newsletter. And all of that good stuff, social media, et cetera, et cetera. Feel free to register here at this link. The correct date will also be there. Next slide, please, Laura. Awesome. So if you want to stay in touch with us, if you're not on our e-newsletter list, please feel free to sign up at this URL down here. We send out an email once a month, or visit us on social media or our website for more information. I did pop the event evaluation link in the chat box at the bottom as well. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out, we'd really appreciate it. Other than that, thank you so much. I know Laura provided her contact information, or feel free to get in touch with my colleague Danielle, who typically runs these events. She has an automated email coming your way after this too. So thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy your afternoon.